$84,000. 1 grant. 168 press releases. On Tuesday, March 11th, 1975, a one-page document went out from the office of Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin. It named the National Science Foundation as the recipient of a new monthly award the senator was calling the Golden Fleece. The figure on the page was the amount the foundation had agreed to pay 2 psychologists studying romantic attraction. The senator's quote was that no one could argue falling in love was a science, and that he did not want the answer. 13 years later, the press releases were still going out every month for 168 consecutive months. This is the receipt for the first one. The grant on the page. In late 1974, the National Science Foundation, or NSF, processed a routine social psychology award. The figure on the file was $84,000. The 2 principal investigators were Elaine Walster of the University of Wisconsin at Madison and Ellen Berscheid of the University of Minnesota. The pair had been collaborating since the mid-1960s. In 1969, they published a textbook called Interpersonal Attraction. It was the first social psychology textbook in the United States to contain a chapter on romantic love, and the field would later treat that chapter as one of the starting points of the modern literature. When Walster and Berscheid wrote it, the research literature on the subject was almost non-existent. They documented the gap themselves while drafting the text. A handful of one-off papers existed, written by researchers who, by Walster's later account, published once and never returned to the question. The pair wanted to fill that gap. The 1974 grant application was the next stage of the project, focused on equity and exchange in romantic relationships, with 2 collaborators at Wisconsin named Mary Utney O'Brien and Jane Tropman Pillamer. The application moved through the foundation's peer review system. The foundation had used outside reviewers since its founding in 1950, partly because its authorizing statute required scientific merit review, partly because the social sciences had spent the post-war decades pushing to be treated as research. By the mid-1970s, the NSF reviewed grant proposals through a combination of mail panels, where copies were sent to scientists across the country for written comment, and Washington panels, where reviewers convened on site. The choice of method, like the choice of reviewers, was left to NSF staff. The Walster and Berscheid proposal went through that process the way every other proposal did. Reviewers read it, returned written reports, and the agency's staff weighed the recommendations. The award was approved. The figure, $84,000, was small by foundation standards, even in 1975. The program was not classified. It was not controversial within the discipline. It carried no political coverage in advance, and it received no press notice on the day the award was made. The check was written. The principal investigators began the work. The grant was, on paper, identical to the thousands of small social science awards the foundation issued in any given year. It would not stay that way. Someone in Washington was already reading the foundation's awards list with a different question in mind. He chaired the appropriations subcommittee that wrote the agency's budget, and he had given his staff a standing order. The Senator's Subcommittee. By the spring of 1975, William Proxmire of Wisconsin had served in the United States Senate for 18 years. He had arrived in Washington in 1957 in a special election that filled the seat after the death of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Proxmire was a Democrat. He held his seat by long margins in a state that voted both ways. He held it on a reputation built around 2 things: fiscal restraint and personal frugality. The personal frugality was on the public record. He refused official car service and turned down travel reimbursement. Most mornings, he jogged 5 miles to the Capitol from his home in Cleveland Park, then ran the 5 miles back in the evening. He kept count of the handshakes he made in a campaign with a clicker in his pocket. He was, by 1975, the senator from Wisconsin who would not let the federal government send a car for him. The fiscal restraint was on the legislative record. Proxmire had voted against the supersonic transport program, the SST, when the Nixon administration brought the funding fight to the Senate in 1971. The B-1 bomber lost his vote too. By the mid-1970s, he had built committee work around the question of how the federal budget was spent, and he had built it loudly. He held a subcommittee chairmanship on the Senate Committee on Appropriations. The subcommittee's jurisdiction covered the appropriations for the Office of Naval Research, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and the National Institute of Mental Health. The Walster and Berscheid grant the foundation had approved. In late 1974, sat inside that jurisdiction. In early 1975, Proxmire issued a directive to his administrative assistant, Morton Schwartz. The directive was for Schwartz to research efficiency in domestic government spending and supply at least one example of wasteful spending each month, dramatic enough to be called to the attention of the senator's colleagues, dramatic enough to discourage similar spending in the future. The source on that directive is not the senator's own publicity. It is the district court ruling in Hutchinson versus Proxmire 2 years later, which describes the program's design in the senator's own pleadings. What Schwartz produced and what Proxmire signed off on was not a piece of legislation. It was not a hearing call. It was not a floor speech. It was a press release. The release was the entire mechanism. The senator would issue it monthly. His office would mail it to the wire services, the Washington bureau chiefs, and the editorial boards of the Wisconsin papers that covered him. The release would name a federal agency, name a grant, name a figure, and carry a quote from the senator explaining his objection. The Golden Fleece of the Month award, in other words, was a planned recurring product. The first example was on its way to the press. The press did not know yet. The first press release. On Tuesday, March 11, 1975, a single sheet of paper went out from a Senate office on Capitol Hill. The sheet was a press release. The sender was Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin. The recipient agency named on the page was the National Science Foundation. The figure named on the page was $84,000. The label printed across the top was new. The senator was calling it the Golden Fleece of the Month Award. The body of the release carried a quote from the senator explaining his objection. "I object to this," he wrote, "not only because no one, not even the National Science Foundation, can argue that falling in love is a science. Even if they spend $84 million or $84 billion, they wouldn't get an answer that anyone would believe. And I'm against it because I don't want the answer. I believe that 200 million other Americans want to leave some things in life a mystery, and right at the top of this list of things we don't want to know is why a man falls in love with a woman, and vice versa." The quote was the engine. It ran on its own. The Wisconsin State Journal carried the release on Wednesday, March 12th. The Capital Times printed it the day after that. By the end of the week, the Associated Press had moved it across its wires. The release traveled the way a finished piece of copy travels, with a name, a number, a quote, and a target. A wire editor in any city could clip it and run it without calling a single source. A radio newsroom could read the quote on the air. A columnist could write around it. The senator's office had not asked for hearings. There was no bill on the floor. Proxmire had issued one sheet of paper, and the country's news machinery had reprinted it. The release worked because it was finished copy. In 1975, a wire editor in a Midwestern city had access to a teletype that ran wire copy through the day, a small newsroom, and a deadline. The editor's job was to find copy that ran without further reporting. Most political handouts from senators failed that test because they named bills, named hearings, named procedural moves that required context the wire reader did not have. The Golden Fleece release did not need context. It named a figure that read as a number, an agency the reader already knew, and a topic that anyone at a kitchen table understood without a glossary. The release had the structure of a feature story and the length of a wire brief. The target had no equivalent product. The National Science Foundation could not draft a peer-reviewed defense between Tuesday's mail and Thursday's deadline. The two principal investigators were teaching, supervising graduate students, and writing their next paper. The Foundation's press operation in 1975 was not designed to respond to a senator's mailing list inside a 48-hour news cycle. The release was on the wires before any defense was on a desk. In Wisconsin, the response began inside a week. The University of Wisconsin at Madison Faculty Senate met to take up the senator's charges against a researcher at their own faculty, and the result of that meeting would be a vote of 84-1 to condemn him. The vote did not move the wires. A faculty senate condemning the senator who held the state seat was, in news cycle terms, less marketable than the original quote. The quote was already moving. Elaine Walster, the senior principal investigator on the grant, would later write that the release produced more national attention in a week than her career had drawn in the previous decade. The defenders were already drafting. A former Republican presidential candidate would write in her defense in the New York Times. 3 Nobel laureates would join him. A senior columnist at the same paper would weigh in. None of those defenses would travel the way the original release had. The senator had built a product that ran by itself. The first month's edition was out. The second was already in production. What the money bought. 6 years before The Fleece, Walster and Berscheid had written something else. In 1969, they had published a textbook called Interpersonal Attraction, and the book contained the first chapter on romantic love in any social psychology textbook in the United States. Walster would later write plainly that when she and Berscheid sat down to draft that chapter, they had almost nothing to draw on. The published research on passionate love was a handful of one-off papers by researchers who had, in her words, run for the hills after publishing. The pair speculated. They labeled the speculation, published it, and then began designing the experiments that would test it. The 1974 grant was the next stage. Walster, Berscheid, Mary Utney O'Brien, and Jane Trautmann-Pillamer were building a research program on equity and exchange in romantic relationships with measurable hypotheses, instruments, and outcomes. The work would later produce the Passionate Love Scale, the standard measure used in the field for more than 30 years. It produced empirical findings on attraction and partner selection, including the way couples evaluated equity in their relationships. By the early 21st century, the pair's collected work had been cited tens of thousands of times in the psychological literature. The senator's press release had said no one, not even the National Science Foundation, could argue that falling in love was a science. The premise was empirically false on the day the press release went out because the science was already underway. The senator was paying for it. He chaired the subcommittee that wrote the foundation's appropriation. He had voted for that appropriation. His subcommittee had approved the foundation's budget that funded the grant his press release attacked. The defenders said so publicly. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, the Republican former presidential nominee, wrote a defense of the grant in the New York Times. Goldwater wrote in defense of the principle that the federal government should fund peer-reviewed scientific research, including research on subjects a layperson might find odd, was one Goldwater believed in regardless of party. 3 Nobel Prize-winning scientists at the University of Chicago joined him in print. Walster did not name all 3 in her later account. She named the institution and the count was 3. James Reston, the senior Washington columnist for the New York Times, wrote a column on the subject. Reston allowed that love would remain a mystery. He added in print that if the sociologists and the psychologists could supply even a suggestion of an answer to the pattern of romantic attraction, marriage, disillusion, divorce, and the children left behind, it would be the best investment of federal money since Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase. The line is on the record. The investigator reading the file in 1975 had access to the same words. Walster's later account named the cost of the original release. She wrote that she received more attention in the week after the fleece than her career had drawn in the previous decade. The mail came in. Some of it was supportive, some of it was not. A friend of hers at the foundation, Roland Radloff, who at the time directed the foundation's social psychology program, suggested privately that she refrain from submitting further grant applications to the foundation for a while. He did not put it in writing. He did not have to. The mechanism by which a senator's press release shifted what an agency officer could safely fund was already operating, without legislation, without a hearing, and without a vote. The University of Wisconsin at Madison Faculty Senate held its vote. The margin was 84-1. The dissenter was not named in the contemporary accounts. The Faculty Senate of a major research university condemning a sitting United States senator on a matter of public criticism of one of the university's own researchers was an unusual act. The vote did not appear on the AP feed. It appeared in the trade press and in the local Wisconsin papers. It did not change the trajectory of the senator's product. The defenders were correct on the facts. The science was real. The grant funded a continuation of work the principal investigators had been publishing for 6 years. The federal government had not been duped. The peer reviewers had not been duped. The senator was attacking a research program he was, in his capacity as Appropriations Subcommittee Chair, simultaneously funding. None of that traveled the way the original release had. The quote had a wire on it. The defense had a column. The quote moved. One press release a month. By April 1975, the staff in Proxmire's office had a working production line. Morton Schwartz, the senator's administrative assistant, was the man whose job description, by the senator's later sworn account, was to research wasteful spending and produce at least one example per month. The first month had been the National Science Foundation grant on romantic attraction. The second month was something else. The third was something else again. Year over year, the Golden Fleece of the Month award went out under the senator's name to the same wire services, the same Washington bureaus, the same Wisconsin papers. The total run, when it ended in December 1988, was 168 awards. 13 years. One sheet a month. The Washington Post, writing in 1988 when the program ended, called it the most successful public relations device in politics today. Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia called it as much a part of the Senate as quorum calls and filibusters. The senator's biographer would later conclude that the Golden Fleece was Proxmire's best-known work and the work most likely to be remembered. The awards targeted federal agencies across the spectrum. The Federal Aviation Administration drew one for a $57,800 study of the physical measurements of flight attendants. The National Institute on Drug Abuse drew one for a behavioral pharmacology grant. Other awards went to the Office of Naval Research, the Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Some of the targeted grants were, by the documented record, defensible work that produced peer-reviewed publications. Some were not. The Fleece did not distinguish between the two on the page. The mechanism that had worked in March 1975, naming a figure, an agency, a target, and a quote, ran the same way for 168 issues. The cost to the original recipients was not abstract. Walster, by her own account, was advised by her friend at the foundation, Roland Radloff, that the foundation's social psychology program could not safely fund her grant applications for some period of time after the fleece. She stopped submitting. Berscheid, in her own later account, attributed a series of personal losses to the fleece and its consequences, including her marriage, her car, and an early retirement she had been planning. The connection between her statements and the press release was her own attribution, and the script does not extend the claim beyond what she said. The foundation's records on the grant the senator had targeted show that the funding was eventually withdrawn. The press release had not withdrawn it. The administrative machinery that processed the next round of applications did. The senator did not pass a law against the foundation. He had not introduced one. There was nothing to vote on. The press release was the policy, the punishment, and the deterrent at the same time. The two original recipients absorbed the cost. So did the foundation. The next researchers submitting a grant application to the foundation's social psychology program in the year after the first fleece absorbed a different kind of cost, the cost of the agency's own caution. None of those costs appeared in any line of the federal budget. They had not been appropriated, authorized, or voted on by anyone. The press releases kept going. They would keep going for 13 years. What survived the fleece? In 1986, 11 years after the press release, Walster, by then known as Elaine Hatfield, and Susan Sprecher published a 15-item questionnaire called the Passionate Love Scale. The scale asks the respondent to think of a person they love passionately at the moment, or once loved, and to rate on a scale of 1 to 9 how true a series of statements is for that person. The questions are simple. The published reliability and validity studies on the scale are extensive. By the early 21st century, the Passionate Love Scale was, by the documented surveys of the field, one of the most widely used measures of romantic attraction in social psychology. The senator's press release had said no one could argue that falling in love was a science. The release had also said that even spending $84 million, or $84 billion, would not yield an answer anyone would believe. 11 years after the release, the answer was a 15-item questionnaire that the field had agreed on enough to use for the next 30 years. Ellen Berscheid became Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota, the highest honor the university confers on its faculty. She continued to publish on close relationships into her 70s. Hatfield, by then at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, received the William James Fellow Award from the Association for Psychological Science in 2012, the field's highest award for sustained intellectual contribution. Hatfield continued to write. By the time of the William James Fellow Award, she had published more than 15 books, including a 1993 work on the history of romantic love co-written with her husband, Richard Rapson. Berscheid's work on the emotion in relationships model, published in 1983, became one of the standard theoretical frameworks for the study of emotional experience in close relationships. The 1969 textbook chapter Walster and Berscheid had written, the first chapter on romantic love in any social psychology textbook in the United States, became the chapter the field cited as the starting point of its subdiscipline. By 2012, relationship science was an established subfield of psychology. It supported peer-reviewed journals and graduate training programs at major universities across the country. The work the senator's press release had attacked was the starting point of the field that built those programs. William Proxmire retired from the United States Senate in January 1989. The Golden Fleece of the Month award stopped that same month. No senator has reissued it under the same name. He had written, in his press release 13 years earlier, that he did not want the answer. By 1989, the answer was being taught in undergraduate psychology textbooks. Proxmire died in 2005. The figure on the original sheet of paper, $84,000, was small, even in 1975. By the most recent calculation in the public record, from Taxpayers for Common Sense in 2021, that figure in present-day terms is worth more than $420,000. The Washington Post had called the Golden Fleece the most successful public relations device in post-war political history. The figure on which it was built would not, in 2021 terms, buy a single-family home in most American cities. The senator built the press release. The press release built his national profile. The principal investigators built the field. At a state university in the spring semester of 2026, a student in an undergraduate social psychology course opens the assigned textbook to a chapter on close relationships. The chapter cites the 1969 work by Berscheid and Walster as one of the starting points of the modern literature on romantic attraction. It walks through the passionate love scale, the 15-item questionnaire Hatfield and Sprecher published in the Journal of Adolescence in 1986. The student fills out the scale as a class exercise. The exercise was added to the course curriculum in the early 1990s. It is still in the course in 2026. The press releases that Senator Proxmire's office issued from March 11, 1975 through December 1988 are preserved in a file at the Wisconsin Historical Society archives in Madison, Wisconsin. The first release is on United States Senate letterhead. The text is the senator's quote in his own words. The figure on the page is $84,000. The release is not on the student's syllabus. The textbook chapter is, "The money you paid for the grant in 1975 funded a body of work the field is still teaching from in 2026. The money you paid for the press release funded a 13-year monthly news cycle that ended the month the senator retired."